Well, thank you so much, Erin, and of course to our esteemed panelists and our student newspaper. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and of course, when I look out into this audience and I see students, that even excites me more, because we are a place of learning, and having our students participate really speaks to the volume of who we are. But the fact that you are here means that as voters, you care about making informed decisions. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that being an informed voter is crucial to our democracy and the future of our communities, state, and our country. This is such a wonderful opportunity we have today, and I don't know how many of you really can relish in how great this is. Erin reminded me it was Super Tuesday today, so what a coincidence that this is happening. But you're going to be hearing from some well-respected journalists from some of Colorado's most reliable and media outlets. We are honored to have all of you here at FRCC. Thank you for coming to share your expertise with us. So I kept asking myself the question when I got the flyer, why are we here? Because politics and elections come with a media landscape that is rife with biases and misinformation. It can be hard sometimes to know which sources is our truth, which sources should we trust. And we probably all know that getting election and candidate information from social media, while easy it is, might often not be the most accurate and unbiased information. So if you're not sure where to turn, that's what our panelists are here to help us with today. They're going to answer some questions and help us learn how to navigate the media's coverage of this upcoming election cycle. And we will learn a lot about voter registration and also literacy around voter registration. Thank you everyone for coming and being a part of this conversation. I always say the greatest thing about democracy is staying engaged, being a part of the conversation and also learning as being part of that conversation. So as you learn about these critical news and media literacy skills that will help make informed decisions, I hope you remember that one of the best gifts all of us can have is to go out and vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simpson, and thank you, members of our community, both here and on Zoom. Being part of our community here and learning more about voter literacy. Before I hand this over to our managing editor, Seth Chancho, the front page, I would like to thank everyone in my department for supporting this event, who've helped me navigate getting our stickers, our buttons, snacks, and everything available for you. I also want to thank Blake Welch, the faculty director of the Student Design Agency, and his students who designed all our internal promotional materials as well as these buttons and stickers. I'd also like to thank Jessica Peterson and Emma Viejos who produced our outward-facing promotional material to help bring local community to this event. Finally, to our student group, Social Club, who is here, the front page, for coming and sharing their information. Thank you again. Today's panel will discuss how our panelists cover elections and provide us tips on how we can all become better consumers of news about candidates and ballot issues. So today joining us are Benta Berkland. Benta Berkland is a public affairs reporter for Colorado Public Radio and co-host of the podcast Purplish. She has covered Colorado politics and government since spring of 2006. Benta's work has aired on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered, America Public Media's Marketplace, and she was a contributor for WNYC's The Next Big Thing. In 2017, Benta was named Colorado Journalist of the Year by the Society of Professional Journalists, and she was awarded with the National Investigative Reporting Award by SPJ a year later. Welcome, Benta. We also have Stephanie Daniel, is also an award-winning journalist at KUNC for Northern Colorado. NPR for Northern Colorado. She reports on a variety of issues affecting the lives of Northern Coloradans, including politics, education, healthcare, immigration, and employment and the economy. Her work has been featured on NPR's 1A, Latino USA, and The Pulse. Additionally, her reporting on the opioid epidemic was part of The Fix, treating New York's opioid crisis. The podcast won an award from the National Association for Healthcare Journalists. Welcome. Next we have Lucas Brady Wood, is the Capitol reporter for KUNC. He covers the legislature, governor, and government agencies. Before joining KUNC, he was the news director at KSJD on an NPR station in Montezuma County in southwest Colorado. While he was there, one of his stories covering the housing crisis won an award from the Colorado Broadcasters Association in the spring of 2022. Both Stephanie and Lucas are spearheading KUNC's America Amplified Election 2024 initiative, which will provide robust community engagement to drive its nonpartisan coverage to help Northern Coloradans, especially young and first-time voters, to participate in this democratic process. Welcome. And we were going to have Corey Hutchins, but he had to drop out, and Linda Shafley has so generously joined us as well. Linda Shafley is the publisher of Colorado Community Media. She has worked for a number of Colorado newspapers, starting with Colorado State's The Collegian, and her hometown newspaper, the Greeley Tribune. She has also done stints at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and Kansas City Star before heading to the Denver Post, where she went from copy editor, designer to managing editor in a 21-year tenure there. Before coming to Colorado Community Media, she led a dedicated political team at the trade publication Colorado Politics. This year, Linda announced the launch of Colorado Community Media's newest publication, La Ciudad, a bilingual newspaper serving Commerce City. Welcome. So now I'm going to hand it over to Seth to start the conversation.
Thank you, Aaron, for that introduction. I wanted to start with a pretty easy sort of background question. Just what drove you to become a journalist? You know, why do you do the work that you do? And I wanted to start with you, Bente. What is it that drives you to be a journalist? Probably have to turn it on.
Oh, sorry. Okay. For a radio reporter, that was bad, not turning on my microphone. So, thanks everyone for hosting us. I would say, you know, I wasn't someone who always knew they wanted to be a journalist, so that's kind of a different story how I came into it. But what drives me, I mean, on the selfish level, it's always learning something new, and the challenge of getting new information, meeting so many different people, and kind of being at the forefront of a lot of things happening in society. Certainly at the state capitol, we see bills and policies on every single topic imaginable that impact Coloradans. And so being at the forefront of that and being on the ground of things that are happening that are shaping society and the country, it's just a fun job. It's extremely challenging. I would say the bigger picture is, you know, the media is a key part of a democracy and a free and open society, and providing information for an informed citizenry to make their decisions. So that's always driving, I think, all of our work as well, making sure that it's, you know, fair, accurate, thorough, and putting all those pieces together. Me?
Yeah.
So I designed my first newspaper when I was 8. I grew up in a large Mexican family, and so therefore, in order to I was always asking the question of what's going on. How are we, you know, what does that mean? You know, my parents would talk in Spanish, so then that way I didn't know what they were saying. And I always was just asking the questions about, here's, you know, and it just journalism kind of grew out of that. I, you know, was in my high school newspaper, and then I went to college assuming that I was going to go into broadcast, and I ended up walking into the Rocky Mountain Collegian and was like, I am home. I'm surrounded by really smart people who are really passionate about what they do, and just wanted to be a part of that community in a way that I think has continued to extend to every place that I've been, is that I've been surrounded by really smart, really passionate people who just want to know what's the real story here. And I was a copy editor, which meant that I wasn't, out on the streets reporting so much, but more like in the office, making sure, being like the reader advocate, and making sure that what was being reported was accurate, made sense, was legible, all of those different things as I moved through the levels that I did at the Post. And that's always something that just stuck with me, is that I want to make sure that the work we're doing is accessible in whatever way. And so, I'm publisher of Colorado Community Media Now, which is 24 suburban weeklies. We have a website as well that encompasses all of those. But we're in Westminster, we're in Northglenn, we're in Thornton, we're in Brighton, Fort Lupton, all over the metro area. And so we feel like what we're doing is we're putting that work that I think, as one of the questions said, the local elections, we're the ones who are providing you with the information for that local elections, and it just heartens me every single day.
Thanks again, everybody, for having us. I also did not start journalism early in my career. I actually went to film school first. I did study documentaries, but lost sight of that passion for a few years until my late 20s, when I came back to journalism and really dove in full force. So the reason I do it, I think, storytelling has always been sort of core to what I do, whatever I do. But I really was looking for more of a public service job than what I had, and I have sort of found journalism combines both of those things, storytelling and public service, in a really strong way, and that's what drives me.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. So I'm also a career changer. I should say that I was on my high school newspaper and was the co-features editor, and then just kind of forgot about that, and I started working in entertainment as a writer-producer of on-air promotion. So I made commercials for TV shows, and I had the opportunity to go out in the field and do some field producing, where I got to just talk to just everyday people, and it really excited me. And then I was sort of at a crossroads in my career, and I decided to go back and get my master's in journalism, and kind of ended up falling into radio. And one of the things that I love most about being a journalist, and this kind of, I think, harkens back to my high school days, is I love reporting on people, and I love talking to people, and I love taking, policy issues, bills, laws, anything, and seeing how they relate to people and how it impacts people's lives. So that's been, one of the best parts about my job, and I take my job very seriously. I think as journalists, a lot of people listen to us, and a lot of people look to us, and I think that's why we're having this panel today, is because we have a real responsibility to our listeners, to our readers, to present the facts. And the more that I do this job, the more that I realize what a privilege it is that I can have that kind of impact, and that sort of guides my work on a daily basis, is just knowing that I am accountable to our listeners and to our readers.
So you mentioned the responsibility that journalists have. I'm curious, for all of you, what role do you think journalists play in our democracy, in our country? How do you see your role as a journalist? Is it just informing people? Is it, uncovering stories that people maybe aren't aware of? What's your role? Bente, if you want to start.
Okay. I think it's on again. Okay. I think it's all of a little bit of everything you said. Uncovering stories, so there's investigative reporting, synthesizing a lot of information and informing the public. Lucas and I are at the State House, and I can definitely say by the media just being at the Capitol, and we're really privileged because we have a space on both chamber floors. There's a media table, And a lot of states don't have that. Reporters aren't allowed on the chamber floors. So we have access to the lawmakers. Granted, committee hearings and everything else are public, but us being in the room changes the conversation. Because, you know, a lot of times I'll hear lawmakers say, I represent X thousand people in my district, and and I'm like, well, we represent people too. I wasn't elected, but we are here for the public. We are the public's eyes and ears. And so I see my job as directly, like, I work for the people, you know? So sometimes just being there, I think, changes things. So I think we're critical to democracy when you see all the mis and disinformation, and, you know, knowing the truth or something as close to the truth as possible is really important for our society to function.
So where we are in the community news ecosystem, for lack of a better term, you know, I feel like our reporters are the folks who are like right there in the communities. We hear often where people talk about, when you ask them, you know, what do you think about the media? They think of CNN, Fox News, et cetera, like up at that national level. And then it's like, but what do you think about your reporter at the Littleton Independent or your reporter at the Westminster Window? You know, it's that it's like, I ran into Monty at the grocery store. You know, and so he knows he is immediately accountable to you all if he's getting information wrong. And he's hearing, because he lives in the community, that here's the issue that we really care about. We really care about the, you know, the what's going to happen with the off-leash dog park. You know, it's those kinds of issues that help make a community, and that when you have those kinds of issues that help make a community, then people feel like, okay, this is what's happening. We have even if you don't have the same view, you have a unified source of information. And that's where community news can be so important, because it helps build that part of it. And then maybe you disagree with somebody, but because you live with them, you are much more civil about it, as opposed to the yelling of what we see on anonymous social media. So I think that's kind of where community news fits into that. And then, of course, to any point that we can, to amplify the great journalistic work that's happening elsewhere in our state that matters to our communities.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And, you know, sort of to connect those two ideas a little bit, I started my career at, it was mentioned, KSJD, which is in the furthest southwest corner of Colorado. Very, very small community, pretty rural and isolated. And that was where I started my career. And there wasn't a very strong journalistic element there. There is a local paper, and the radio station was there before me, but I came in with a goal of really sort of giving this community some robust local news and accountability. And I found that, you know, when I started doing some of that reporting in this town, you know, going to the school board meetings, going to city council, and really digging into some of these issues and uncovering things that people didn't know about, while at the same time you know, I think that uncovering new stories and informing people is one and the same in a lot of ways, just because, you know, as an everyday person, you just can't know about everything that's going on. And so it's our job to find the things that maybe some people don't know what's going on, and then explain them in a way. And so, you know, it's about accountability, it's about finding the stories, it's about explaining the stories. It's you know, and one thing that Stephanie and I are learning a lot about is it's also, you know, about engaging with the community and talking with community members who may or may not be readers or listeners, but connecting with those people. And so I really take sort of the tack that I discovered at KSJD with the community news and really try to apply that on the state level at the Capitol, right? Because it's, you know, an editor at NPR once told me, you know, if it's a good local story, chances are it's a good national story, right? So it's really about focusing the stories in the community, no matter how big they are. And I think that, I mean, I view my role as Benta had said, you know, to serve the public. That's how I view my role, and I just try to sort of filter all of those things that I just talked about through that element and taking myself out of it. It's not about me, it's about the public.
I just want to piggyback on something that Linda said. So, she oversees these, hyper-local, these community papers. Lucas and I work on a regional NPR station as well as Benta, and there is a need for all of these outlets. There is a need for the hyper-local, there's a need for the regional, there's a need for MSNBC and CNN, because they all give a different perspective. And one thing that I'm noticing is there is a shift towards news outlets working together and partnering together and trying to expand the reach. And I think it just benefits everyone because you are getting different points of views, you're seeing different sides, and I think it gets away from these news silos that we kind of find ourselves in, because you can turn to your local paper and find out what's going on with the dog park and those things, and then you can turn on KUNC and CPR and maybe get hear a story about what's happening at at the State House for the day, or hear a feature about a story, something that's going on up in the mountains. So I think it all helps us become better informed as citizens about what's going on locally as well as regionally, statewide, and of course across the nation.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Absolutely.
So one of the reasons why I think that the collaboration that's going on between news organizations is so important is because so many news organizations have contracted. And that, there was a point in 2009 when we had the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post, the two largest news organizations, that had between them nearly 600 journalists. And now we have, the Rocky Mountain News went away. We have the Denver Post, which has less than 100, probably less than 70. I think Colorado Public Radio is the largest news organization in the state now. But I mean, it's impossible for one organization to be everything to everybody. And so it does take a village in order to make sure that the public stays informed.
Yeah, that's really great. So you talked, or all of you sort of touched on this idea of maybe obviously informing people and making sure people know what's going on in their communities. But I guess when one of the big issues right now in the media space is, and you mentioned this, or somebody mentioned this, was this idea of misinformation. And so what I'd like to ask is, how do you know when something is misinformation? How do you find misinformation? How do you identify it? And what can you do if you do identify it? And how do you avoid it? Bente, if you want to start it. That might be a harder one.
That's above, okay. It's good. That's above my pay grade. I don't have an answer to that. I wish I did know. I know that lawmakers are trying to tackle that. I'm not saying that's the answer, but there's legislation this session that would, at least on election information, try to communicate whether it was generated through AI. That's one piece. I know there's a lot of entities, and Linda or other people may know more than this. I mean, I'm really not an expert on this. I think it's getting increasingly more difficult. When we're reporting on issues, I can speak from a reporter perspective because I cover a lot of election mis and disinformation. NPR calls it like this truth sandwich, and maybe other outlets do too. So let's say I'm interviewing a source who is, I want to include their quote and their perspective, but it is misinformation. Making sure that, we don't want to kind of belittle our sources, that they have the opinion they have, especially if it's just a regular person. But we'll try to say that what's accurate before and after their quote, putting that in context so we can include that perspective, but then the audience, the reader, isn't getting misinformation in the course of the reporting. So that didn't fully answer your question on how users can spot mis and disinformation and what they can do about it. So I don't know if anyone else has a better answer, because I don't have a great answer on that.
I don't know if you guys want to go next. Or...
I can speak a little bit. You want to go first?
No.
I don't know how to answer that question.
I mean, I can't say that I have an answer, especially because, mis and disinformation is constantly evolving with what you just mentioned with AI stuff, with voice AI and video. I think part of it from a reporter perspective, you just mentioned this True Standards. I just literally ran into this yesterday. I was talking to some election experts, and we were talking about the narrative that the establishment and the justice system are coming after former President Donald Trump. And I wanted to provide some context to that, but there were some interesting quotes there. And I ended up not quoting this one source because I didn't have enough room to contextualize his quote. So instead of, it was a short spot, it was like 45 seconds for our newscast, so it was very short. So there wasn't a lot of room to contextualize. So I decided to sort of put some more explanation into my narration and sort of choose a different quote from him that sort of built on that. So it's sort of about balancing, a lot of times, you want to call out misinformation. The instinct is to call out misinformation, but sometimes by calling it out, you can perpetuate it if somebody just tunes in for a second or something like that. So I think the way that I approach it is really just, if I see a piece of information that I'm doubtful about, really doing some robust research reporting and trying to find out for myself if this is a piece of misinformation or what the facts are behind it, right? As a consumer, it's tough, these days, and I think a lot of it has to do with, seeing this information and making inferences for oneself based on what you're reading, the source, who's saying it, whether there's facts and context to back it up. I think being able to look at those things, the context and the sources as a consumer is getting more important than it ever was before. And that's tough because everyday folks often don't think about those things.
Go ahead.
Well, there's an adage. Is this on? Hello? There, okay. So there's an adage among that from journalists from way back that says, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And so that's a big part of where, unfortunately, the public has to spend a lot more time checking that out than they ever did before. It used to be, and of course this was in the days before X was Twitter, or I should say Twitter was X, and that it used to be that it's kind of like I would hear about some event and I could go to Twitter and I'm still trying to curate that feed to where I'm getting a bunch of journalists. And so that way I can see what they're saying at the Boston Globe and what they're seeing at the New York Times and what they're seeing at, at least in just that little piece. That has become a lot harder and it's a lot less trustworthy. And so it's like, okay, so what do I do now? I go to the trusted news sources that I have looked at in the past, but that's not the only place that I'm going. I'm also, if I'll go to NPR, but then it's like, okay, well, this is something that's happening in Kentucky, then I'll go to see what I can find at the Louisville paper, or, and just so that way I feel like I'm kind of getting a rounded, a rounded view of it. And if I feel like, okay, well, they're kind of seem to be reporting on the same things, then I feel like, okay, I've done what I can. That's where it makes it hard when it comes to a local level, because, if you're looking for something that happens at the Arvada City Council, chances are it's going to be our one reporter with Arvada, who is the person who is on the ground, who sees that story, who understands the context and everything that kind of goes along with that. And so it makes it a little bit harder, but that's the part of it where it is trying to use all the things. There's a great website called newsliteracy.org, and that they do this sort of work. They do training on fact checking. They do training on making sure that you understand your sources, and that there's that sort of work that kind of goes into so that at least when you hear something, and especially if it's provocative for lack of a better term, that you kind of stop and just don't immediately like retweet it, reshare it, you know, spread it around, that you're actually stopping and saying, you know, that just doesn't sound right. And so then taking that extra time to kind of check out what they're saying.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's really easy to become a journalist these days. I mean, you just get on Twitter and you like spout something, or I saw this, or I went to a city council meeting and they said X, Y, and Z. But you don't know if that person is actually representing the truth of what happened, or if it's their opinion. So I think it gets confusing. So to Linda's point, I think we do have these trusted news organizations that you can go to, and you can fact check some things, and maybe something, you know, I mean, listen, we all make mistakes. So maybe there's something that we covered and you're like, I don't know, that maybe doesn't make sense to me. Then you go to another news outlet and do a little bit more digging. To the question about misinformation, so I did some reporting on Black immigrants and refugees in Aurora. And one of the stories that I did was around ethnic media. And one of the things that came up in my reporting is that there was a lot of misinformation around COVID that their communities were getting through Facebook, through other social media. So they really took it upon themselves to provide facts and to make sure that people understood, you know, that they should be getting their vaccines and all these different things. So I think that is a real example of you know, small community organizations, community media organizations, really looking at the needs of their communities and making sure that they can provide a service for them. And that's part of that public service part of journalism, to make sure that they have the facts and that they understand, you know, what is misinformation, what is false, and then what is accurate.
I just want to add one quick thing. I think also, as a news consumer, if you're reading something and there's not like a clear reporting process sort of or sourcing in the thing you're reading, if it's not like, you know, attributing certain claims to sources that you can, you know, see in the article, for example, I think that's a problem. So I think that, you know, responsible journalists will you know, make sure to attribute and, you know, give context and allow the reader to see where this information is coming from. And if you don't see that, I think that that's a sign that there needs to be some more digging into whatever this info is.
Yeah. A lot of you mentioned media, trusted media sources. I think both of you talked about that. You mentioned something about the people feeling like the establishment is coming for their political candidate. And I have a stat here that in 2022, according to a survey done by Pew Research, only 34% of Americans have at least a fair amount of trust in the mass media. That's compared to 68% who say that they have little or no trust in the media, which is the highest since they began conducting the survey in 1972. And so I think we're up here, we're talking about here's how you can inform yourself, but I feel like a lot of people are going to hear this and think, you know, when you say trusted media source, they're thinking a biased media source. They're thinking a media source that's going after my guy. And so I guess I want to ask, why do you think so many people have lost trust in the mass media, and what can we do about it to regain their trust, or at least make alternative media more fact-based? Benzie, if you want to start again, although you don't have to.
Yeah, I'll let someone else start on this one.
I'll take this one. I think it's really complicated, actually, why there's been a lot of loss of trust in the media. I think that, I mean, a lot of this is opinion, but I think that, you know, we've seen a loss in local news outlets. We've seen these models not being sustainable. We've seen the news organizations gutted by hedge funds, and I think the loss of the local connection to the news is a big reason for a loss of trust, and sort of, you know, the on the flip side, the presence of the 24-hour news cycle that we see on TV, that's sort of, you know, when people think of media, they think of the CNNs, the Fox News, the NBC, you know, and I think that there has unfortunately, there's a lot of opinion and punditry on some of these networks that is, there's not a clear line between that and the news and reporting. And I think that that has caused a lot of confusion, whether conscious or not, but you know, when you hear a news story and then someone's opinion, I mean, a lot of people are going to disagree with that, and that might not be based on, you know, have the clear reporting process that I talked about that builds trust. So I think that these are two things that first come to mind, but I think it's very complicated. I think social media has to play into it. I think it's very complicated, but I think those are some small points.
Yeah, I think, you know, when it comes to social media, there's all these algorithms that, you know, the more hits that a story gets, the further up it rises in your feed, so the more people see it. And I think a lot of people have just started shouting, and it's just like, it doesn't really matter what I say, but if I have that clickbait headline, somebody is gonna come. They're gonna come, they're gonna look at it, it's gonna, you know, help us with their ad dollars and all of these other things, really getting away from actually providing like accurate and fair-based news. And it just seems like everyone just has an opinion. Even people who are supposed to be journalists, it seems we're moving away, especially I think with the national news and you know, cable news and this 24-hour cycle, because they are so focused on one issue, and then the opinion creeps in, and then the shouting starts. I'm listening to a lot of, like, even on ESPN, I like to watch sports, and it's just like, why are you shouting at me? You don't need to shout your opinion. And I just find that is happening a lot. And I mean, but it's working because people, they get the clicks and, you know, and that drives ratings and things like that. But what is being missed is that nuance and actually really having like a balanced conversation, because it just turns into a shouting match.
Yeah, I think, you know, to jump on what Lucas was saying, I believe you know, there's a term that is very common among journalists to talk about news deserts, and that the expansion of essentially where the people live, where there is not any local news in their community, has expanded exponentially in the last, you know, 15 years. In the last 10 years, I think that the core of journalists, like people who are employed as journalists, has been nearly cut in half. I believe there are some reports that 2 news organizations close every week for like the last, you know, 5 years. So it's all in that same period of when you see mistrust. Because if you're not seeing a journalist at an event, if you're not seeing a journalist in your community, then you're thinking, well, why is, you know, somebody that the only time that they're coming is when they're parachuting in, which is another term in terms of, you know, a parachute journalist who comes in when there's just, you know, some big news event that's happening in that particular community. And that, you know, I mean, we need more journalists. That's a huge part of what will help with the trust part of it, because as I said, people have a really high distrust of national media because they don't see those people on a daily basis, but they do see the people who are in your hometowns. And then on the other side of it, there's been a change in culture where we now question the refs, and that essentially, you know, journalists are trying to do their best in terms of saying, well, here's what we found, here's what we're able to confirm about X issue, and that when you are just not going to believe it because you're like, they're biased, or, you know, whatever your situation is, that's going to be the thing that kind of helps, you know, continue to build that mistrust narrative. And then that becomes a case of where then journalists who are trying to do the right thing are getting questioned, or getting attacked for the views when they're saying, I'm sorry, but what you're saying is not accurate. And that goes, you know, that's an issue for the left, it's an issue for the right. It's, you know, so politics isn't necessarily something that's playing a part in that. It's essentially the way that we need, that journalism in particular needs to find a way to like make people understand that we're not trying to take sides, but, you know, if it's raining, it's raining. And it's not that I've got to go, you know, well, some people say it's raining and some people say it's not. It's like, no, it's raining. That's the fact. And so that's the part of it where I think journalists just have a real struggle in terms of trying to make that happen.
Yep, I agree with what everyone said, 100%. The only other thing I would add is that I really think it's also a symptom of just the polarization we're seeing in society, and Linda touched on that. And politicians on both sides of the aisle love to, quote, call out the media, whether it's fake news or biased or whatever. It's an easy kind of entity because everyone consumes media. No one may know actually a journalist, and it's just kind of this, you know, I don't want to say boogeyman, but it's very easy to just be anti-media. You know, no one's really going to be upset with you if you bash the media on one side or the other. And so I think it's just such a huge political talking point at this time. And I'm seeing it on the far left, far right, you know, way more than I ever did starting out as a journalist. I would say working in the job I do, we do build up a lot of trust with sources. So people may feel like they hate the media, but oh, not this individual reporter. They see our work, and you can build trust that way. So in terms of what we can do, you know, we're just small little sands in a vast sea. You know, we're not that important in the grand scheme of things. So we can only focus on our own stories and building trust with, you know, the sources we work with. I think one of the best compliments I had was a story I did, a pretty big story on just kind of an analysis when Lauren Boebert's race was as close as it was. I did a big digital story, and some of my colleagues interviewed people from across the district, and I had an email from someone who supported Lauren Boebert, and he said, you know, I've read this big long thing you wrote, and I for the life of me, I've tried so hard to figure out what you think about Lauren Boebert personally, and if you support her or don't support her. And he said, I just absolutely can't figure out. So he said, but good job on the story. So, you know, maybe that was one person who said, okay, they didn't do a biased job.
Yeah, that's a great story. Both of you, I think maybe you two mentioned social media as part of the reason why people are losing trust in the mass media more generally. And so I'd like to ask, do you think that social media platforms need to be doing more to stop the spread of misinformation? What do you think about something like Twitter's community notes feature, where people can, if there's a post that has misinformation, they can suggest to add a community note, and it will show up alongside the tweet, and it will notify anybody who liked the tweet, and it will hopefully inform people better. Do you think other platforms should adopt that? Do you think they need to be doing something else entirely? What do you think? Does anybody want to start?
I can try. Yeah, I to be perfectly honest, I have pretty little faith in social media companies implementing things that will fix this problem. Something like the community notes thing. I'm on Twitter. I post only professionally on Twitter. You know, Twitter is what it is. People aren't going to Twitter to read community notes. They're going to click on links and to see people yell into the void, really. So I mean, that's pretty cynical, but I really haven't seen any of the efforts on social media really put any stop to this misinformation. So I don't really have much answer to that, other than, you know, I mean, I just try to be responsible on Twitter as much as possible, but you know, there are definitely outlets like NPR that are not on Twitter. You know, KUNC is our page. We do not post on Twitter. As I post as myself as a journalist, but KUNC suspended their Twitter. It's still present, but no posts, no new posts. And you know, I see why. But I also, it's really tough. I don't have an answer for it, but I don't trust the social media companies to fix it. It's not in their best interest.
I also think, just to double down on the cynicism, people can say, oh, you flagged this, they are trying to censor me. Like, I'm trying to tell the truth and they are censoring me. And I think that we've seen that as well. So, yeah, it's a really big issue and I don't have anything else to add to how to fix it.
So, to be honest, I mean, you know, I've been in the industry long enough that my life as a journalist predates Twitter and Facebook and MySpace. And I think that I definitely don't have that trust that social media, because they won't even identify themselves, even though they put out a lot of media information, they refuse to identify themselves as a media company. That even though media is in their name, they say they're a technology company. And so that's where their responsibilities lie, is in just making sure that they're delivering for their company and not necessarily doing what journalistic outlets are trying to do in terms of informing the public. They just want to say, we are engaging the public, so then that way we can sell their information to advertisers, and that makes them more valuable to their shareholders and everything that kind of goes along from there. And so to try and say, hey, I need you to, there have been, you know, other governments that have tried to put some of those sorts of clamps on them, and they resist wholeheartedly because they say that's going against the notion of free enterprise and everything else that kind of comes along with that. And that's the part of it that unfortunately, I don't have much faith in, that they would be able to do it. And so then, because of the fewer journalists, and there's a void there, and nature abhors a vacuum, and so that stuff fills in where journalists aren't. You know, whether there's something else that can be changed with that, you know, Google, and I think possibly Facebook or Meta are trying to like say, oh, we're trying to do these initiatives that help support journalists, but it's only because it, you know, helps stave off any other kind of government intervention. But you're seeing a lot of like of legislation and lawsuits that are going after social media companies, but you know, they're going to fight those as, you know, because they say it goes against our ability to be a business. So again, not very positive.
I don't really have anything.
Okay. Well, you mentioned regulation, and Bente, you actually wrote an article about this. And you mentioned it earlier, the Colorado State House introduced a bill that would require AI-generated electoral-related content to be labeled with a disclaimer saying that it's AI-generated. And I'm curious, do you think that AI poses a threat to our democracy? And do you think that a bill like this is going to be enough to stop it from doing that?
I definitely don't think it will be enough, but I think more transparency is helpful when we can. So I think anything that could have someone pause and say, okay, is this accurate? You know, my editor said her husband the other day saw something and was like, is this true? And then after like 15 seconds, it was like, oh gosh, yeah, this is an AI deepfake. But you know, it's a lot of times we've all heard the phrase, it's too good to be true. You know, it probably is too good to be true if you think it's too good to be true, but a lot of people, they want to believe something that's true. And I think we all do this to an extent in our personal lives, or think of your own families. People want to believe something that it may not be true, but they want to think that's true. And so I think that human nature poses such a big risk, but I think the labeling seems like a pretty good idea. I mean, it's one small piece of it. You know, the technology is just evolving so quickly, so it's hard to predict. I feel like they're trying to legislate for things we know now versus 10 iterations down the road that are going to be more problematic.
Yeah.
You know, I actually just heard this story last week that companies that, like, you know, are trying to draw in clicks and everything like that have, you know, buy shuttered newspaper sites, websites, and then just stuff them full of AI-generated content that will draw people to there. And of course, the way that you draw people to that content is to make it, very polarizing and, provocative and everything else that goes along with it. So it's like, and this happened the instance they were using was out of Clayton County, Iowa, where a newspaper there combined with another paper, and so they abandoned their old website. Well, some company came in from Serbia, I think, bought it up and then just stuffed it full of AI sludge. And so it is that case of where I'm glad to see that they're trying to figure out what they can do about this, but I agree with Bente that essentially what is happening is so fast that it's really hard to know where AI goes. I mean, there's lawsuits, there's legislation, there's all kinds of hand-wringing, but, what it changes, I don't know if we know that yet.
And one other thing I would add is, passing a law would be one thing, but how effective is that going to be? How is it going to be implemented? How is it going to be enforced? How will it be followed? All of that plays into it.
I think also too, talking about enforcement and implementation, even if you break the law and you put something out there that is fake, it is much harder to retract things. So once it's out there, it's out there. So that's another thing to consider too.
The only thing I want to add, I think that it's this kind of legislation flagging an AI piece is, and it strikes me what you said, having that moment of doubt where it's like, is this real? I think at the end of the day, the only thing I can think of that will sort of counter, misinformation is media literacy amongst the public, and people eventually people will look at a video and automatically think, is this AI or not, right? But that's going to take a while, and I don't know if we can survive that long, but hopefully we can.
The rule is don't have journalists on a panel to hear optimistic.
Yeah. This next one's not any more optimistic, I don't think, but a lot of these sort of conversations about misinformation and AI, they happen at a national scale, right? Everybody in the country knows about Twitter and is talking about ChatGPT and all this stuff. And I'm curious, are there unique ways in which this stuff is going to impact local media, which is obviously what all of you do, or do you think maybe you're not as worried about it, or anything in between?
I mean, I think definitely. I mean, yes, I think it's being talked about on a national level, but I almost, again, think that, while a lot of people hear these terms, I don't know if there's a whole lot of understanding about what they really mean. And there's, a lot of, sensationalism around them that in a lot of ways is warranted. But if you're just, riling people up without understanding of what something is and can be, I mean, that's a problem. So, and I definitely think it really has just as much threat on the local level as the national level. I mean, these AI software creators, content creators, they're not expensive, and a lot of people can utilize them. So I think that, they definitely are. I'm not as personally worried as a journalist that ChatGPT is going to start writing articles, or especially doing radio stories. I mean, that's a possibility. But again, I'm not as worried about that. I think journalists need to just focus on sort of doing their job and not worrying about that. But I'm more concerned about the political system and elections than journalism and media.
I think that, actually, Corey Hutchins, who was supposed to be on this panel, he did an article where he was kind of rounding up how Colorado newsrooms are using AI and using ChatGPT. And I mean, he says, I mean, and across the spectrum, and we were one of the ones that was interviewed on it, is that, we see it as a tool. There are companies out there whose job it is to help journalists and news organizations like summarize their news for newsletters. So, we have 24 publications. I have 8 newsletters, and I would do more, except for the fact that I will kill the staff if I do that. And so therefore, if I could afford the AI, software, system that they have that does it in a responsible, way, then I would probably use it. We would try to use it. But it always is a case of any time that there's some sort of AI that's being involved, we want to make sure that there's a human that's involved with that it's like if they're summarizing something, there's an editor who's following behind them and making sure that they do it right. And where we see irresponsible AI is either in the case of that they are trying to misinform somebody, or they are using it as a way to not have a human involved. My son graduated from CSU, was working in marketing, and he started working at a marketing company, and they asked him, they said, okay, well, here's the quota, what we expect you to produce in your day. And he's like, now that I've been doing this, I don't think I can produce this much. And they just said, oh, just use AI. And it was like, this is how you can accomplish the things that you need to accomplish. And that's the kind of thing where then you just run into trouble. It's like, then you're putting out misinformation, you're putting out disinformation, and you're doing it irresponsibly. And that's the part of it that makes artificial intelligence just such a real threat, is that you're either doing it intentionally or unintentionally in order to save time, money, whatever. And that's where, we need to make sure that journalists are staying at the forefront of saying that's not right.
I just want to add one quick thing. I mean, and it's also, talking about tools, I mean, we, especially in audio journalism, we use transcription softwares all the time. I mean, print journalists too now with Otter.ai, and that's all AI. So it's more complicated than just a boogeyman, AI the boogeyman. It really is already an important part of our work in a good way.
All right. So we're running up at 1 o'clock. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We can do questions if any of you want to stick around for Q&A. I can ask the very first question just to get us started, which is related to the last one, and it's definitely not just one of the ones I had on the list. Do you think people are too focused, since we're talking about local news, are people too focused on national news? Do people need to pay more attention to local news? And if so, how do we get them to do that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really view my job as, trying to help people get focused one way or another. I think it's tough. People are busy, they're working, they have families, and there's only so much capacity you have to either pay attention to the news, follow it, and then when some big national thing's happening, that may be the thing you want to pay attention to. And I've definitely talked to plenty of voters who kind of feel like they're taking a news break just for their own mental health coming out of COVID, because it's so toxic and polarizing. They just don't want to deal with it at all. And that's an unfortunate reality. So I'll be curious to see how much we see that play out. I don't think anyone's super excited about Biden versus Trump 2.0. How engaged are people going to be in this election heading into November? Because that's going to just dominate a lot of the news. So I don't know if people are going to tune out even more, but it's possible.
I think a lot of it comes back to the news deserts that Linda was talking about. I mean, if you don't have a local news outlet, then how are you going to learn about your community? Like you just can't unless you are attending, every school board meeting, every local city council meeting. But I mean, who's got the time for that? So your default is, local broadcast news, which, they go into communities, but again, they are covering a wide swath or the national media. So I think if we don't invest in local journalism, then it's going to be really difficult to give people that. And I mean, you know, you don't know what you don't have, or whatever that statement is, but you know what I mean? Like, so I think it really comes back to a lack of local media outlets.
Yeah, I would just also I don't think it's the news consumer's job to shift their focus for what's best, if that makes sense, right? Like, people cannot be expected to, you know, make super strategic decisions about the future of news and what they're looking at, right? Like, this is a bigger issue about the news business, where it is, how sustainable it is. And, you know, news we have to make it easy for people to consume news, otherwise they're just not going to do it. So it's not on the consumer. I'm not saying it's on the reporters. There's not a clear answer here, but it's a systemic thing. But it has to be a service to the people. They can't be responsible for keeping it alive, if that makes sense.
And that's the reason why public media is so important, because it needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be a lot of those things. So then that way, when people are ready to find it, they can find it.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody if you just raise your hand if you've got a question you want the panel to answer, or I have a few here that I can go down if that's easier.
So I'm kind of wondering about how you make sure you throw in checks and balances into what you report on. I'm an avid listener of NPR, just had to throw that out there. But I think it's hard because you can really show your bias or your opinion by pretty much anything, like who you're picking to interview and which stories you're bringing to the forefront or not. And even with data, like 85% of people are doing this, but whoa, 15%, that's a lot. So like, I mean, even the way that you can bring up those things can show like an opinion or a bias. And I feel like in a social justice lens, you need to be bringing those things up. But how do you kind of make sure that you're including some of those other things and getting other people's perspectives and things like that?
In my opinion, that's why diversity in newsrooms is so desperately needed. You know, it is that case of the echo chamber, and I think that there's been a real conversation, especially as, you know, newsrooms have closed or have contracted, that a lot of diversity left as that happened. And so there's a lot of conversations. I'm part of the Colorado News Collaborative, and they did a project that they started in 2021 called the Voices Project. And it was Black voices, Latinx voices, Indigenous voices, AAPI. Like, they were very interested in making sure that they were wanting to hear from community members about what is it that you're missing from your local news. And that what in many cases, especially for underrepresented communities, it was definitely that notion of, I don't see me, I don't hear me. And so how do we change that? And that's the part of it where news organizations are trying to make up for that and go that extra way in terms of, you know, foundational grants, in terms of like just making an effort at DEIB, in terms of, you know, source auditing, which I believe you all do, and just making sure that we are doing what we can to make sure that nothing about us without us.
I think, just to give you an example, so we have checks and balances. Like, we always work with an editor. You know, we'll do fact checking, all of that stuff. But just to give you an example, we had a series, and the reporters spoke to people who identified as both Hispanic and Latino. And, you know, they all get lumped into one sort of demographic group. And the question was something about, you know, like, what word should you use? And I was like, just go ask them. like people will tell you if you know just ask somebody like, and even now a story that I'm working on, he's an immigrant from Mexico, and I was like, do you want to be called Hispanic or Latino? And so I just asked him, and he told me. So I think it's really important to listen to our sources and to the people that we interview. And then just real quick, on a positive note for journalism, so there's been a lot of focus around the elections on listening to the voters and listening to communities. So doing less of like, I'm blanking on the term, what is it called? The races, the horse.
Oh, the horse, yeah.
Horse
race coverage,
The horse race coverage, and focusing more on the issues. And we are part of KUNC, we are part of a couple of initiatives that are really focused on local community engagement and asking our listeners and our readers, like, what are the issues that are important to you? What questions do you have, and how can we answer them? How can we be a resource to you so that you're better informed about the issues? And this is something that is going on at news outlets across the country, because I think we realize that we need to do a better job of serving our communities. And the way that we can do that is listen to our communities and what the needs are and what they want us to cover for them.
And I just have one quick follow-up on your question. I think that, getting accurate quotes and facts, that's one thing, but it's true that the framing of the story can really shape, whether or not it's biased. So there always is gonna be a frame. So I think don't just take the frame as a journalist, the first person you interview or pitches you something, that may not be the framing you end up going with. So lawmakers like, hey, we're doing this great thing, and then you do more reporting, and it's like, well, actually, I want to frame it from this other angle. So I think one check is just doing the reporting and talking to a lot of different sources and getting a lot of different information and giving everything the full weight it needs to have in the piece.
I just had one quick thing. I was just going to add, you mentioned source auditing, and just to explain a little bit more about that is we have a system where we track our sources by various demographic statistics, and we input those, and so that over time gives us a map of who we've been, what sorts of people we've been going back to and using over and over versus who we're missing. So that's a way that, and I think about that when I'm sourcing or choosing who to include in a story, right?
And I think it just to sort of reiterate what Benta was saying, we choose who we talk to. So it is really on us to talk to a diversity of people, so that we don't keep going to the same sources, we don't keep repeating the same story. And I think that comes back to the public service part of our job, is how can we really cover our communities if we are leaving out one specific demographic group? Like, we are not doing our job very well.
I think that's where AI can help a little bit too. Like my in-laws are watching, they speak Cantonese, so they're watching Chinese news cable for news about America because that's being offered in the language that they are most comfortable with.
Point, yeah.
And so it's there isn't local media available in the language that they're most.
I will say that there's been a movement to have more community media organizations or ethnic media organizations to fill that gap. And that there's a lot of they're sprouting up in different languages because of that thing of like, where you can get your news from if you don't speak English.
Right. That's, that was one of the reasons that we started La Ciudad, was that, it's a bilingual newsletter for primarily Commerce City, northeast section of the metro area, because we know that that there are, a large majority of the folks there are Latino, and then of that group, 30 to 40% of them do not speak English, do not read English. And, and so it's trying to make sure that we are getting that your language should not be a barrier to the, quality or at least local news that matters to you. And so that's one of the reasons why we formed La Ciudad.
Yeah, news deserts are not always geographic.
Right.
Right? There can be, and we talked in New York City when I lived there about news deserts. We talked about, I was saying news deserts aren't always geographic, right? There can be news deserts for certain communities within areas, right? In Denver, where there's robust news outlets in English, but certain communities are left out, and that creates a news desert on its own.
That's a great point. We've got one more question.
Just a comment, Bill, I wanted to do. So I've been streaming this, and I've been kind of following the chat. So no specific question or anything have come up there, but I just want to share with you all that we have really broadened not only just people who couldn't be here in this room, but we've had people from Fort Collins, Canyon City, and as well as Littleton. So definitely we're getting a lot of all parts of the state. So it's kind of neat to just want to share that with you all, that like this is being shared out, and it's going to be we have a recording of it too that we'll be sharing out too. So yeah,
We'll let you know your reach.
Yeah, that's great. It's really, I think this has been a great panel. I'm really happy that all of you were able to be here, and thank you all for coming. Thank everybody on the Zoom and everybody in this room for coming. Thanks to Aaron for organizing this event. He did probably all the work. And thank you for Dr. Simpson for the introduction. I don't know if there's anybody else, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Colorado Community Media is always accepting internship applications. There's often opportunities for jobs. So I just got to throw that pitch in there for that, and I have some information here.
I'm used to handing you the microphone.